Tonight, on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to Brighton, 1850, where the salt air carries secrets and the shingle beach hides love letters beneath its stones. You stand on the promenade at dusk, watching two gentlemen walk arm in arm toward the pier, and the locals do not even look twice. Here, in this seaside town perched on England's southern coast, something extraordinary is happening. While London prosecutes men for sodomy and Victorian morality tightens its grip across the empire, Brighton has quietly become a refuge. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered why certain places become havens when the rest of the world burns? Have you ever wondered what it felt like to step off a London train into a town where you could finally breathe? What did two men do when they could walk together by the sea without constant fear? How did word spread through the underground networks of Victorian England that Brighton was different? Who were the men brave enough to build lives there when hiding was supposed to be the only option? What made this one seaside town refuse to care about the laws that destroyed men everywhere else? And have you ever wondered what we lost when we forgot their names? Congratulations. You have just arrived in Brighton, sometime around 1840, carrying a single leather case and enough secrets to fill the British Museum. The train journey from London took 3 hours, which is roughly 2 hours and 59 minutes less terrifying than explaining to your family why you needed to leave. Let us see if you can survive. Good luck. The first thing that hits you when you step off the train at Brighton Station is the light. It is different here, sharper. The sky opens up in a way London never allows. All that coastal brightness pouring down onto cream-coloured Georgian terraces that curve along the shoreline like a smile. The second thing that hits you is the smell. Salt and seaweed and fish, and that peculiar Brighton combination of expensive French perfume mixed with working-class sweat. The third thing, if you are paying attention, is the feeling that you are being watched. Not with suspicion, with recognition. You are not the first young man to arrive in Brighton with that particular look in his eyes. By 1820, Brighton had already spent decades as the playground of the dissolute, the artistic, and the financially comfortable. The Prince Regent, soon to be George IV, had built his absurd Indo-Gothic pleasure palace, the Royal Pavilion, right in the centre of town. The pavilion alone was enough to signal that Brighton operated under different rules. Its onion domes and minarets rose above the respectable English seaside like a fever dream, and inside, the prince entertained his mistresses, his drinking companions, and his collection of fascinatingly artistic young men, with virtually no oversight from the moral guardians of London. The historian Colin Simpson called Regency Brighton a laboratory of permissiveness. Walking through its streets in 1825, you would understand why. The town's economy ran on pleasure. Visitors came for the sea bathing, which physicians had decided was medicinal. They stayed for the gambling, the theatre, the promenades, the scandals. Money poured in. Moral surveillance poured out. In London, your landlady knew your business. Your employer knew your associations. The church knew your absences. Your family knew everything. In Brighton, if you had money, no one knew anything they did not want to know. Privacy was for sale, and the entire town was in the business of selling it. This was the soil in which queer Brighton grew. Let us start with a man named Thomas Creevey. Not because he was gay, he was not, as far as the records show, but because his letters give us the texture of Regency Brighton society, and texture is what makes history breathe. Creevey was a politician and diarist, and he spent years in Brighton observing its characters. In his letters, He describes men who kept house together without raising eyebrows, theatrical performers whose gender presentations scandalized London but entertained Brighton, and an overall atmosphere of moral elasticity that both fascinated and appalled him. He wrote in 1821 about attending a dinner party where two gentlemen arrived together, shared a plate, and spent the evening in what he called the most particular attention to one another. No one commented. The hostess simply ensured they were seated side by side. That silence was everything. In London, that same scene would have ended in whispers, blackmail, or worse. In Brighton, it ended in desert. You arrive in this world with almost nothing. A letter of introduction, perhaps, from a London friend who whispers that Brighton is more accommodating. You find lodgings in one of the boarding houses near the seafront, modest but clean, run by a landlady who has seen enough to know that questions lose her customers. Your room overlooks the sea. The window is always slightly open because the salt air is supposed to be healthy, and the sound of the waves becomes the rhythm of your new life. You unpack. You breathe. You realize that for the first time in years, you are not calculating the distance to the nearest exit. The first week, you do nothing but walk. Brighton in the 1840s is a walker's paradise if you are trying to figure out where you fit. The town is small enough to cross in an hour, but large enough to get lost in. You walk the Stein, the open grassy promenade that stretches from the pavilion down toward the sea, and you watch the world parade past. Ladies in crinolines, working men hauling nets, children throwing stones at the water, and everywhere, pairs of men. Some are clearly just friends, some are clearly more than friends, and the trick, the skill you develop fast, is learning to tell the difference by the smallest signals. A hand resting on a shoulder a moment too long, a shared glance that lingers, the way two men angle their bodies toward each other, even when they are pretending to watch the sea. You are learning a new language, and no one is teaching it except observation. The chain pier is where you go when you want to be seen. Opened in 1823, it stretches out into the water like a skeletal finger, all iron and wood and improbable ambition. You pay your penny and walk the boards, and the whole town uses it as a social laboratory. Couples promenade, artists sketch, and men who are looking for other men take the same slow circuit, round and round, catching eyes. There is a rhythm to it. You do not speak first. You do not approach directly. You simply walk, and if someone is interested, they fall into step beside you. Then you walk together. Then maybe you stop to look at the water. Then maybe one of you mentions a particular pub, a particular boarding house, a particular circle of friends. This is how networks were built in the 19th century, one careful conversation at a time. By the 1850s, Brighton had developed what we might call an infrastructure of discretion. Certain pubs were known. Certain boarding houses accepted male couples without question. Certain areas of the beach, especially the sections west of the town centre toward Hove, became understood as spaces where men could swim together, lie on the stones in the sun, exist in their bodies, without the constant Victorian mandate to perform rigid masculinity. The historian Matt Cook, working through court records and newspaper archives, found almost no sodomy prosecutions originating in Brighton itself during the entire Victorian period. That is not because gay men were not there. That is because the town had collectively agreed not to look. Compare that to London, where between 1806 and 1900, more than 60 men were executed for sodomy or related charges. Compare it to the northern industrial cities, where a single accusation could mean prison, hard labour, or chemical castration. Brighton's silence was not indifference. It was protection. Let us meet Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton, because their story runs directly through Brighton and shows both the freedom and the fragility of queer life in this era. In 1870, Park and Bolton were arrested in London's Strand Theatre for appearing in public in women's clothing. They were lovers. They were also theatrical performers who delighted in drag, and their case became a national scandal. The trial transcripts are extraordinary documents. Hundreds of pages of testimony, letters, and medical examinations trying to determine whether these two men had committed sodomy. The prosecution failed. Park and Bolton were acquitted, largely because their defense argued they were simply theatrical eccentrics, not criminals. But here is the Brighton connection. During the investigation, letters were discovered showing that Park and Bolton had spent months in Brighton, living together openly, attending parties, and performing in local private theatricals. Witnesses from Brighton were called to testify, and almost universally, they claimed to have noticed nothing unusual. Two young men sharing lodgings, performing in drag at private parties, walking arm in arm on the promenade. The Brighton witnesses shrugged. They had assumed it was theatre. They had assumed it was harmless. They had, conveniently, assumed anything except criminality. Neil Bartlett, in his work on Victorian queer culture, calls this willful blindness as community care. Brighton's residents were not naive. They were complicit in the best possible way. You find your people slowly, carefully. A conversation in a pub leads to an invitation to a musical evening. The musical evening introduces you to a circle of artists, writers, and men of independent means who have also washed up on Brighton's shores. Someone mentions a swimming club. Someone else mentions a reading group that meets on Thursday evenings. You start to see the same faces in the same places. The tea rooms on North Street, the bookshop near the Pavilion, the second balcony of the Theatre Royal, where tickets are cheap and the lighting is dim. One evening, a man introduces himself as Edward. He is older than you, maybe 40, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of calm that comes from having survived things he does not discuss. He teaches Latin to the sons of wealthy families. He has lived in Brighton for 15 years. Over tea, he explains how it works. The key, he says, stirring sugar into his cup, is never to force the town to notice. If you are discreet in public, Brighton will be discreet about you. Make a scandal, and you will discover that the town's tolerance has limits. But if you simply live, work, walk, love quietly, you will find that no one here has the energy to care. You ask him if he lives alone. He smiles. I share a house with a friend, a very dear friend. We have done so for 8 years. Our neighbours bring us soup when we are ill. That night, walking back to your lodgings along the seafront, you cry for the first time since leaving London, not from sadness, from relief. The legal reality bears repeating because it makes Brighton's atmosphere even more remarkable. Sodomy was a capital crime in England until 1861. Even after the death penalty was abolished for sexual offences, the punishment was 10 years to life in prison with hard labour. The 1885 Labouchere Amendment expanded the law further, criminalising any act of gross indecency between men, even in private. This was the law used to destroy Oscar Wilde a decade later. Gay men in Victorian England lived under a legal regime designed to erase them. And yet Brighton existed. How? The simplest answer is money and selective enforcement. Brighton's economy depended on attracting visitors, and visitors wanted freedom. The town's police force was small. Its magistrates were often former London elites who had moved to Brighton specifically to escape rigid society, and the local government had no interest in prosecuting cases that would scare off the wealthy eccentrics who kept the town afloat. Prosecuting sodomy required witnesses willing to testify, and in Brighton, witnesses were remarkably hard to find. The unspoken rule was, do not involve children, do not involve violence, do not make it impossible to ignore, and you will be left alone. This was not safety, but it was closer than anywhere else in England. You find work tutoring the children of a wealthy widow who spends summers in Brighton and does not ask questions about your personal life as long as you teach her sons adequate French. The pay is modest but steady. You write letters to your family in London, carefully edited, describing your respectable life by the sea. You do not mention Edward. You do not mention the swimming parties. You do not mention the man you met at the bookshop who slipped his address into your coat pocket. Your life splits into two versions, like everyone else's here. The public version is bland and unremarkable. You are a tutor. You attend church occasionally. You take constitutional walks for your health. The private version is the one that matters. You share dinners with men who understand you. You attend salons where poetry is read aloud and no one performs heterosexuality as a costume. You fall in love cautiously with a journalist named William who writes for the Brighton Gazette and has a laugh that sounds like light breaking through clouds. William has lived in Brighton for 3 years. He shares a flat with another journalist, but he is looking to move. One evening, over wine, he asks if you might consider sharing a house. You say yes before he finishes the sentence. By 1860, you have been in Brighton for 6 years. You and William rent a small terrace house in Kemptown, the neighbourhood spreading east from the town centre, where rows of cream stucco houses climb the hill overlooking the sea. You have a parlour, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms. You tell the landlord you are cousins. He does not believe you, but he accepts the rent. You learn to navigate the unspoken rules. In public, you and William are friends, colleagues, housemates. You do not hold hands on the street. You do not kiss goodbye at the train station. But in your own parlour, with the curtains drawn and the door locked, you are simply yourselves. You read to each other. You argue about politics. You fall asleep on the sofa with his head on your shoulder. It is a small life, but it is yours, and it is more than most men in England ever get. The town conspires to let you have it. Your neighbours include a pair of elderly women who everyone knows are more than friends, a widowed actor who hosts dramatic readings in his drawing room, and a doctor who lives with his secretary. No one comments. You bring soup when someone is ill. They bring flowers when you host a dinner party. The texture of ordinary life wraps around you until you almost forget that 5 miles outside Brighton, men like you are still being arrested. Brighton's gay geography had landmarks, and learning them was part of your education in survival. The Royal Pavilion grounds after dark were understood as a cruising area, risky but possible if you were desperate or bold. The Turkish baths on Grand Junction Road, opened in the 1860s, became a semi-open secret, a place where men could see each other's bodies and sometimes arrange to meet elsewhere. The beaches west of the town, especially near the old fishing villages being swallowed by Brighton's expansion, offered privacy during off hours. And certain pubs, the Marlborough, the Greys, the smaller unnamed taverns in the lanes, had back rooms where men gathered and landlords claimed ignorance. None of this was organised. There were no gay bars in the modern sense, no openly advertised safe spaces, but information travelled. A trusted friend would mention a place. You would go, cautiously. You would see familiar faces. The network grew by whisper and shared risk. The danger was always there, lurking like a low tide that could come back in. In 1871, a man named George Wilson was prosecuted in Brighton for gross indecency after propositioning an undercover police officer on the beach. He was sentenced to 2 years hard labour. The case was a warning shot. The town could protect you only if you stayed within invisible boundaries, and those boundaries shifted. A change in local government, a new chief constable, a moral panic stirred up by a scandal elsewhere. Any of these could mean that Brighton's tolerance contracted overnight. You and William talk about this sometimes, late at night when fear gets the better of comfort. What would you do if the police came? Where would you go? William keeps a bag packed in the wardrobe, just in case. You think he is paranoid until you remember George Wilson, and then you pack one too. But most days, you simply live. You walk to the seafront in the morning and buy fresh bread from the bakery that opens at dawn. You tutor your students and correct their Latin grammar. William writes his articles and complains about his editor. You host dinners where friends bring wine and argue about Tennyson. On Sundays, you walk the downs, the rolling hills stretching north from Brighton, where you can see the whole coast laid out beneath you, and pretend, for an afternoon, that the world is nothing but sky and grass and the man walking beside you. One of the most fascinating figures in Victorian Brighton's queer history is a man named Charles Brookfield, though his story is darker. Brookfield was an actor and playwright who lived in Brighton during the 1880s and became infamous as an informant. He testified against Oscar Wilde during Wilde's trials in 1895, and historians believe he fed information to the authorities about gay networks across southern England. Brookfield himself almost certainly had relationships with men. His personal letters hint at it, but he saved himself by betraying others. Brighton had men like Brookfield too. The town's tolerance was not universal, and survival sometimes meant throwing someone else to the wolves. You learn quickly who can be trusted and who cannot. Discretion is not just about hiding from outsiders. It is about knowing which insiders would sell you out to protect themselves. The 1885 Labouchere Amendment changed the calculus for everyone. Suddenly, even private acts between consenting adults were criminal. The law was vague enough that almost any intimacy could be prosecuted as gross indecency. Blackmail became an industry. All over England, men received letters demanding payment or threatening exposure. Some paid, some fled, some took their own lives. In Brighton, the immediate effect was a tightening of the networks. The casual openness of the 1850s contracted. Men became more careful about who they invited into their circles. Parties moved from semi-public salons to entirely private homes. The Turkish baths added more scrutiny. The beaches saw fewer late-night gatherings. But the town did not turn on its gay residents. That is the remarkable part. Brighton could have followed London's lead and launched a moral crusade. It did not. The local newspapers occasionally printed scandalized reports about decadent elements, but prosecutions remained rare. The implicit deal held, be discreet, and we will not destroy you. You and William stay. You talk about leaving, maybe France, maybe Italy, where the laws are different, but Brighton is home now. You have friends here. You have a life here, and the risk of starting over somewhere new, with no network and no knowledge of the local dangers, feels worse than staying in a place where you at least know the rules. So you adapt. You become more careful. You burn letters after reading them. You stop attending the larger gatherings. Your circle contracts to a handful of men you trust absolutely, and you hold on. By 1890, you are 53 years old. You have lived in Brighton for 30 years. William is 56, his hair entirely grey now, his hands cramped from decades of writing. You still share the house in Kemp Town. Your neighbours still bring soup. Your students, now grown, sometimes visit and bring their children to meet Uncle William and Uncle Thomas. The children do not know what you are to each other, but they know you are safe, you are kind, and you make excellent tea. The world outside has not improved. Oscar Wilde's trials in 1895 sent shockwaves through every gay network in England. Men fled to the continent. Men destroyed their letters. Men married women in panic. The trials proved that fame, talent, and wealth could not protect you if the law decided to notice. But here, in your small house by the sea, you are still alive. You are still together. And on the nights when the fear is too heavy, William takes your hand across the dinner table and reminds you, 30 years. We have had 30 years. Most men do not get 30 days. You do not know if you will be remembered. You do not know if anyone will care that two ordinary men loved each other in a seaside town and built a life on stolen time. But you know this, you existed, you loved, and Brighton let you. That is more than history promised you. So you take it, and you hold on, and you survive. The architecture of Brighton tells its own story if you learn to read it. Walk down any street in Kemp Town or the lanes, and you notice something unusual for Victorian England, an extraordinary number of houses designed for 2 or 3 residents, not families. Small, elegant terraces with just enough room for a parlour, a dining room, 2 bedrooms. No nurseries, no servants' quarters beyond a single maid's room. These were not family homes. They were built for couples who would never have children, for artists who needed light and quiet, for men of independent means who wanted privacy. The builders knew exactly what they were constructing. Brighton's property developers in the 1820s and 1830s created an entire housing stock that catered to people living outside conventional family structures. Thomas Reed Kemp, who developed much of Kemp Town in the 1820s, designed his crescents and squares with an aesthetic that valued elegance over utility. Large windows, high ceilings, generous proportions in the main rooms, but compact overall footprints. Beautiful enough to attract wealthy tenants, small enough that a household of 2 could manage without extensive staff. Staff meant witnesses. Small households meant privacy. The architecture was complicit. You and William occupy one of these houses, and every detail of it reflects the life you are permitted to live. The front parlour is respectable, the room you show to tradesmen and the occasional visitor from your professional lives. Books on the shelves, a pianoforte. William barely plays, prints of Italian landscapes on the walls. Nothing personal, nothing incriminating. The back parlour is where you actually exist. Williams's desk occupies the corner by the window, covered in papers and ink stains, and the organised chaos of a working journalist. Your chair sits near the fireplace, upholstered in fabric you chose together from a shop on North Street. The books here are different. Poetry you actually read. Novels pass between friends with certain passages marked in pencil. The objects tell the real story. 2 pipes on the mantelpiece. 2 sets of slippers by the hearth. Photographs of men whose names you would never speak in public. The bedroom you share is on the 2nd floor, overlooking the small back garden. You have lived in this house for 28 years, and in all that time, you have never once had to explain to a visitor why there is only 1 bedroom clearly in use. The other bedroom exists for propriety, its bed made, its wardrobe holding spare linens. But everyone sleeps where they sleep, and your bed is the one with 2 pillows worn into permanent indentations. You wake most mornings to the sound of gulls screaming over the rooftops, and the smell of the sea drifting through the window you leave cracked even in winter. William wakes before you, always. You have learned to track his morning routine by sound, the creak of floorboards as he moves to the window, the scratch of a match as he lights the lamp, the particular sigh he makes when his knees protest the cold. Some mornings you lie still and pretend to sleep just to listen to him exist. After 30 years, the sound of another person breathing in the same room still feels like a miracle you do not take for granted. Brighton's lesbian community existed too, though the records are thinner because women had different survival strategies. The law barely acknowledged that women could have sexual relationships with each other. Queen Victoria famously refused to believe it was possible, so lesbian couples faced less legal danger but more economic precarity. Women could not own property easily. They could not access most professions. Their survival depended on either having independent wealth or finding creative arrangements. Historian Lillian Faderman documented networks of women living together in Victorian seaside towns, and Brighton appears repeatedly in her research. Women called each other companions or dear friends, and set up households that looked, to the casual observer, like spinster arrangements. 2 aging unmarried women sharing expenses. Perfectly respectable. No one looked closer. One of the most visible was a woman named Anne Lister, though she was more associated with Yorkshire than Brighton. But Lister's diaries, written partially in code and only decoded in the 1980s, show she visited Brighton regularly in the 1830s and connected with women there who recognised what she was. Lister used Brighton as a place to exhale between the suffocating propriety of her Yorkshire estate. She walked the Chain Pier. She attended the theatre. She met women whose names she recorded in her private cipher, and those meetings were clearly romantic, clearly sexual, clearly part of a network that understood itself even if it had no public language. You knew women like this. One of your closest friends in Brighton was a woman named Charlotte who lived with her cousin Margaret in a house near the Pavilion. Charlotte taught music. Margaret painted watercolours that sold to tourists. They had lived together for 16 years when you met them, and within 10 minutes of conversation, everyone involved understood the situation. You and William had dinner at their house once a month. The four of you played cards. You talked about books. You never discussed the obvious because you did not need to. Charlotte died in 1887, very suddenly, of pneumonia. Margaret was not allowed to attend the funeral. Charlotte's brother came down from London and took control of the arrangements, and he made it clear that Margaret's presence would be inappropriate. You and William went to the funeral. Margaret sat in your parlour and stared at the wall. When you got home, you found her still sitting exactly where you had left her. She had not moved in 3 hours. "I cannot prove we were family," she said quietly. "So legally, I was no one to her." She moved away 6 months later. You never saw her again. You think about her sometimes, about how grief with no public recognition becomes a kind of erasure. Charlotte died, and the world recorded that a music teacher passed away, unmarried, no children. The world did not record that Margaret lost the love of her life and had to pretend it meant nothing. You hold William tighter after that. You know the same fate waits for both of you. The 1890s brought a new kind of visibility, and visibility was dangerous. The wild trials in 1895 dominated every newspaper in England. The details were lurid, the language was vicious, and the outcome was brutal. 2 years hard labour for gross indecency. Wilde's fall became a moral panic that rippled outward. Suddenly, every man who lived with another man was suspect. Every artistic bachelor was questioned. The networks that had quietly existed for decades found themselves under sudden scrutiny. In London, men fled. In Brighton, men went underground. The parties stopped. The salons closed. Even the pubs that had been safe became dangerous as police presence increased. You and William stopped attending anything that could remotely be described as a gathering. Your social life contracted to the handful of people you trusted absolutely, and even then, you met in private homes with the curtains drawn. The fear was not abstract. In 1896, a man named Henry Newlove was arrested in Brighton after an encounter on the beach. The details in the newspaper were vague, but the sentence was not. 18 months hard labour. Newlove was 63 years old. He did not survive his sentence. He died in Lewes Prison 7 months into his term, cause of death listed as heart failure, which was the Victorian way of saying the prison killed him. You read the notice in the newspaper, and your hands shook so hard, William had to take the paper away from you. "We are careful," William said. "We have always been careful. We will be fine." You wanted to believe him, but Newlove had probably thought the same thing. The thing about fear is that it changes how you inhabit your own life. You started calculating risk in every interaction. A smile held too long. A hand on a shoulder in public. Dinner with friends who might know friends who might talk. You had spent 30 years building a life in Brighton, and suddenly it felt like the whole structure could collapse if one person decided to notice. But you stayed. Where else was there to go? Brighton's economy continued to grow through the 1890s, even as its moral atmosphere tightened. The train connections improved, bringing more day trippers from London. The West Pier opened in 1866, joining the old chain pier as a destination for promenading. Hotels grew taller, the population swelled, and with growth came a new kind of anonymity that paradoxically offered fresh protection. In a town of 12,000, everyone knows everyone's business. In a town of over 100,000, you can disappear into the crowd. By the late 1890s, Brighton had become large enough that the old intimate scrutiny was impossible. You could walk down Weston Road and pass 300 strangers. No one tracked who lived with whom anymore unless you forced them to notice. The networks adapted. Instead of salons, men met in public spaces, tea rooms, bookshops, the upper levels of the libraries where scholars worked in silence. A particular table at a particular cafe became understood as a place where you might meet someone, a particular section of the beach. The systems that had been explicit became implicit, and implicit was safer. You and William developed your own private rituals that kept you sane. Every Sunday, weather permitting, you walked to Rottingdean, a village 2 miles east along the coast. The walk took about 40 minutes, following the clifftop path with the sea crashing below. In Rottingdean, you had lunch at a pub where the landlord had known you for 15 years and never asked questions. Then you walked back. 3 hours of your week where you could talk freely, argue, laugh, exist as yourselves with nothing but the sky and the gulls as witnesses. On one of these walks, in the summer of 1897, William asked if you had any regrets. You thought about it. The question was harder than it sounded. "I regret that we have to hide," you said finally. "I regret that I cannot introduce you as my partner, my love, my life. I regret that when one of us dies, the other will have no legal right to grieve publicly. I regret that everything we have built together will be dismantled by distant relatives who think they have more claim to our lives than we do." William nodded. He had expected this answer. "But do you regret choosing this life?" he pressed, knowing the cost. You stopped walking. Below you, the sea was that particular shade of grey-green that meant autumn was coming. A ship moved slowly along the horizon. You thought about the boy you had been in London, suffocating under the weight of expectations, terrified of his own desires. You thought about the first night you had spent in Brighton, hearing the waves through an open window and feeling, for the first time, like you might survive. "No," you said, "I do not regret it. Not for a second." William smiled, and you continued walking. The historical record preserves fragments of lives like yours, but mostly it preserves absences. We know that men lived together in Brighton. We know that households of 2 or 3 men were common enough that census takers did not comment. We know that certain addresses appear repeatedly in police records as places of suspicion but rarely prosecution. We know that letters were burned, diaries were destroyed, and photographs were carefully curated to show nothing incriminating. What we do not know are the names of most of the men who made Brighton their refuge. We do not know their daily routines, their inside jokes, their fights and reconciliations. We do not know which of them died surrounded by the people they loved, and which of them died alone in rented rooms with strangers disposing of their possessions. History is written by people who survived to write it, and gay men in Victorian England spent most of their energy simply surviving, not documenting. But the architecture remains. The houses in Kemp Town still stand, most of them converted now into flats or boutique hotels. The streets still curve down toward the sea. The pavilion still rises absurd and beautiful above the town. And if you know what to look for, you can still see the ghost geography of queer Brighton mapped onto the present. One of the more unexpected sources for understanding Victorian Brighton's gay life comes from the diaries of a vicar named Francis Kilvert, though Kilvert himself was not from Brighton. He visited in 1874 and recorded his impressions of the seafront. Among his observations was a note about a surprising number of men walking in pairs, very particular pairs, not the usual companions of work or sport. Kilvert was not approving, but he was observant. He noted that locals seemed utterly indifferent to what scandalized him. He attended a church service and was disturbed that the congregation included several such pairs sitting together in pews, accepted as if ordinary. This outside perspective is useful precisely because Kilvert noticed what Brighton residents had stopped seeing. The town had normalized same-sex partnerships to a degree that shocked visitors from more conventional areas. That normalization was not acceptance in the modern sense. It was not legal recognition or social celebration, but it was a kind of pragmatic tolerance that allowed people to live. You benefited from that tolerance every single day. The baker who sold you bread knew you lived with William. The postman who delivered letters addressed to both of you knew The doctor who treated you when you had influenza in 1889 noted in his records that your housemate was your primary caretaker and should be informed of any changes in your condition. These small recognitions added up to a life that was livable, but they also remained fragile. In 1898, a new chief constable was appointed in Brighton, a man named Thomas Waugh, who had previously worked in Manchester and brought with him a more aggressive approach to public morality. Within 6 months, prosecutions for public indecency increased. The Turkish baths were raided. Several men were arrested for solicitation, even though the evidence was thin and the encounters had been discreet. The community reacted with familiar tactics: withdraw, hide, wait for the storm to pass. You and William stopped going to the baths. You stopped walking certain routes at certain times. You became, once again, hyper-aware of who was watching. Waugh's tenure lasted 3 years before he moved on to another position. The prosecutions slowed. The community exhaled. But the episode was a reminder that Brighton's safety was always conditional, always dependent on the particular constellation of people in power at any given moment. You turned 60 in 1897. William turned 63. You had both reached an age that Victorian England considered elderly, though you felt no different than you had at 40, beyond the aches in your joints and the way stairs had become a negotiation. You still worked. Your tutoring had shifted to adult students learning languages, which paid better and demanded less energy. William had retired from daily journalism, but still wrote occasional pieces for the Gazette, essays about local history that the editor appreciated for their detail and clarity. Your house had become a small archive of your shared life. Books you had bought together, their margins filled with notes in both your handwriting. Furniture you had chosen piece by piece over decades. A garden you had planted and replanted until the roses finally took. Objects accumulated meaning. A particular teacup that had survived 3 moves. A clock that had stopped working in 1883, but that neither of you could bear to throw away. A framed sketch of the seafront that William had bought you for your 40th birthday. You had never had a formal ceremony, never exchanged rings, never spoken vows, but you had built a marriage in every way that mattered. You knew each other's rhythms. You could predict each other's moods. You argued about the same things you had argued about for 20 years. William's habit of leaving books open face down, your tendency to forget to close cabinet doors, the correct way to make tea, whether the front room needed repainting. The arguments were boring and domestic and precious. One evening, sitting in the back parlour with the lamps lit and the fire burning low, William looked up from his reading and said, "We have been lucky." It was not a question, but you answered anyway. Incredibly lucky. Most men do not get this, he continued. Most men like us live alone, or marry women and destroy themselves, or flee to Paris and drink themselves to death. We got to stay. We got to build something. You set down your book. We are not dead yet. Do not start writing the eulogy. He smiled. I am not. I am simply noticing. We have been lucky, and I do not want to forget to be grateful for it. The conversation stayed with you. Luck was part of it, certainly. You had been lucky to find Brighton, lucky to find each other, lucky to avoid prosecution, scandal, illness, all the 1,000 disasters that ended men's lives early. But luck was not the whole story. You had also been brave. You had chosen each other again and again, every day for 3 decades, in a world that offered you no support and considerable danger. That was not luck. That was will. Brighton in 1900 stood on the edge of a new century, though no one knew yet what that century would bring. The Victorian era was ending. The Queen herself was ailing, and everyone understood that her death would mark a symbolic shift. The town had grown into a major resort, its population nearing 130,000, its economy booming. Electric trams had replaced horse-drawn carriages on many routes. Electric lights were being installed along the seafront. Modernity was arriving, and with it, new possibilities and new dangers. For queer men, the legal situation had not improved. The laws remained brutal. Prosecution was still possible, still devastating when it happened. But the networks had learned to adapt, to survive, to find each other despite everything. Brighton remained a refuge, not because it was safe, it was not, but because it was safer than most places, and safety was relative. You and William made plans cautiously for the future. You talked about what would happen when one of you died. You had written wills leaving everything to each other, though you both knew distant relatives could challenge them. You had prepaid for burial plots in the extramural cemetery north of town, side by side, though the headstones would not name the relationship. You had sorted through papers and burned the letters that were too explicit, too dangerous to leave behind. These were not morbid preparations. They were acts of care. You were trying to protect each other and the life you had built, even after death. On a Sunday morning in March 1900, you walked to Rottingdean as usual. The weather was cold and clear, the kind of early spring day where the light is sharp and everything feels scrubbed clean. You stopped at your usual spot on the cliffs, looking down at the sea. 34 years, William said. You did the math in your head. He was right. 34 years since you had met in the bookshop. 34 years of breakfasts and arguments and walks and dinners and quiet evenings reading side by side. Not bad for two men who were supposed to be criminals, you said. William laughed, that same laugh that had hooked you decades ago, bright and sudden and entirely without self-consciousness. You stood there together, watching the waves, and you thought about all the men who had not made it this far, the ones who had been caught, the ones who had fled, the ones who had taken their own lives rather than face exposure. You thought about George Wilson, dead in prison. You thought about Henry Newlove, his heart giving out on a stone floor. You thought about Charlotte, whose love for Margaret was never publicly acknowledged. You thought about all the names you would never know, all the lives that had been destroyed or truncated, or simply lost to silence. And then you thought about the men who had survived, the networks that still existed, quieter now but present, the houses in Kemptown still sheltering pairs of men who called each other cousins, the new generation arriving in Brighton, drawn by rumours and whispers, and the faint hope that here, maybe, they could breathe. Brighton had not saved everyone, but it had saved some, and you were among them. The question of how information travelled between queer communities in Victorian England is one historians still debate, because the networks left almost no paper trail by design. But Brighton's role as a hub was unmistakable. The town sat on the main railway line between London and the continent, men travelling to or from France, where the laws were marginally less brutal, often stopped in Brighton for a night or a week. They brought news, they connected people, they carried messages between communities that could not safely correspond by post. You became part of this network almost accidentally. A friend of a friend arrived from London in 1883, a young man named Arthur, who was fleeing a blackmail threat. He needed a place to stay for a few weeks while he arranged passage to Paris. You and William gave him your spare room. Arthur stayed for 6 weeks. During that time, he mentioned other men he had met, other cities with their own hidden geographies. Manchester had pubs. Liverpool had certain boarding houses. Edinburgh had a thriving artistic community where men could disappear into Bohemia and call it aesthetics. When Arthur finally left for Paris, he asked if he could give your address to others who might need it. You hesitated. William said yes. Over the next 15 years, your spare room sheltered perhaps 24 men. They arrived with little warning, usually sent by someone you knew or someone who knew someone you trusted. They stayed anywhere from a few days to a few months. Some were fleeing blackmail, some were fleeing violent families, some had simply heard that Brighton was safer and came to see if the rumours were true. You fed them. You helped them find work or passage onward. You asked no questions beyond what they volunteered. This was how queer community functioned in the 19th century. Fragile chains of trust extending across cities, sustained by people willing to take risks for strangers. You were never raided. You were never questioned. But the possibility hung over every arrival, every departure. One informant, one angry neighbour, one piece of bad luck, and the whole network could collapse. The men who passed through your house carried stories that filled in the map of queer England. A man named Samuel from Birmingham described factory workers who paired off and lived together in lodging houses, their relationships understood but unspoken among their colleagues. A man named Thomas from Newcastle talked about the theatre world, where everyone knew which actors preferred men and which managers would look the other way as long as the shows made money. A man named David from rural Somerset described complete isolation, years of thinking he was the only person in the world who felt this way, until he read a coded personal advertisement in a London newspaper and realised there were others. Each story was a small correction to the historical record that claimed men like you did not exist. You existed. You had always existed. And you had found ways to survive even when survival seemed impossible. One of the men who stayed with you in 1891 was a journalist named John Addington Symonds, though he did not stay long and he did not need shelter. He was already famous, already wealthy, already dying of tuberculosis. Symonds had written extensively about Greek love and Renaissance Italy, scholarly works that were really coded explorations of homosexuality. He had spent time in Switzerland, where he lived with a younger man named Angelo Fusato, a relationship that scandalized the expatriate community, but which Symonds refused to hide. Symonds came to Brighton to meet other writers, and someone in his circle mentioned your name as a safe contact. He appeared at your door on a Tuesday afternoon, elegant and exhausted, and asked if he might join you for tea. You spent 3 hours talking. Symonds was brilliant and bitter in equal measure. He spoke about the impossibility of writing honestly in England, the way every true sentence had to be wrapped in layers of classical allusion and scholarly distance. He spoke about the men he had loved and the cost of loving them. He spoke about his daughters, whom he adored, and his wife, whom he had married out of duty and destroyed in the process. I have spent my entire life trying to justify what I am through scholarship, he said, stirring his tea with a distracted hand. As if loving men needed justification, as if it were not simply the truth of my nature. You asked him why he continued writing if it required so much disguise. Because someone must, he said simply. The men who come after us will need to know they are not alone. They will need proof that we existed, that we thought about these things, that we tried to make sense of it. If I wrap the truth in enough Latin, perhaps it will survive the censors. Symonds died 2 years later in Rome. His most radical work, an essay called A Problem in Modern Ethics, was published privately and immediately suppressed. But copies survived. They circulated through the same underground networks that had brought him to your door. And men read them and recognized themselves. You thought about Symonds often after his death. He had been so much braver than you in some ways, publishing under his own name, living openly with Angelo, refusing to pretend. But he had also paid a devastating price. His health had collapsed under the strain. His family relationships were shattered. His reputation was permanently shadowed by whispers. You had chosen a quieter path, a smaller life, and you had survived longer because of it. There was no right answer. There was only the choice each man made about how much visibility he could endure. The daily texture of your life in Brighton remained remarkably ordinary despite the extraordinary context. You shopped for groceries, you mended clothes, you argued with the butcher about the quality of his lamb. William developed a passion for gardening in his 60s and spent hours coaxing vegetables from the small plot behind the house. You read newspapers and complained about politics. You attended concerts at the Dome when the programs interested you. You lived. This ordinariness was itself a form of resistance, though you did not think of it that way at the time. Simply existing, building a mundane domestic life in a world that insisted you should not exist at all, was radical. Every morning you woke up in the same bed as William was a refusal. Every dinner you cooked together was defiance. Every year you survived was proof. The census records from Victorian Brighton preserve evidence of this resistance if you know how to read them. The 1881 census lists hundreds of households headed by 2 or more men with no familial relationship. Lodger was the usual designation, Though many of these lodgers had lived at the same address for decades, some households listed professions that made logical sense. 2 clerks sharing expenses, 2 shopkeepers, 2 teachers. Others made no economic sense at all. A barrister and a musician, a retired army officer and a bookseller, a physician and an artist. The census takers wrote down what they were told and asked no further questions. The record exists, carefully neutral, documenting arrangements that everyone understood but no one would name. You and William appeared in the 1891 census as householder and lodger, occupations listed as tutor and journalist. The same designation you had used for 20 years. The census taker who came to your door was a young woman with ink-stained fingers who seemed far more interested in finishing her rounds than in your domestic arrangements. She asked the required questions, wrote down your answers, and left. The entire interaction took less than 5 minutes. That night, you and William laughed about it. Lodger, as if William paid you rent, as if the house were yours and not equally both of yours, as if 30 years of shared life could be reduced to a single bureaucratic category. But you also understood the necessity. The fiction of lodger was what allowed the truth of partnership to continue. You said the acceptable words, and in exchange, you were left alone. The artistic community in Brighton provided another layer of cover for queer residents. The town had attracted painters, writers, and musicians since the Regency period, and artistic eccentricity was expected and even encouraged. A painter could live with his male model and call it convenience. A writer could share a cottage with another writer and call it economy. The assumed bohemianism of artistic life created space for relationships that would have been impossible in more conventional professions. You knew several artists who used this cover effectively. A painter named Robert lived with a younger man named James, who ostensibly worked as his assistant and studio manager. Robert painted seascapes that sold well to tourists. James stretched canvases, mixed paints, and managed the practical side of Robert's career. They had lived together for 12 years. Everyone in the local art world knew they were lovers. No one said it aloud. Robert and James hosted gatherings in their studio every few months, informal evenings where artists and writers and musicians crowded into the space and argued about aesthetics while drinking cheap wine. You and William attended these gatherings regularly. They were loud and chaotic, and utterly unlike the carefully controlled sociability of respectable Brighton, and you loved them for exactly that reason. At one of these gatherings in 1894, you met a young writer named Aubrey Beardsley, who had come to Brighton for his health. Beardsley was 22, brilliant, dying of tuberculosis, and utterly uninterested in hiding his aesthetic sensibility. His illustrations walked the line between art and obscenity. All elongated figures and sexual ambiguity and decadent beauty. He spoke about his work with a feverish intensity, as if he knew he had limited time and needed to say everything quickly. "The point is not to depict what is," he said, gesturing with a cigarette that scattered ash across his sleeve. "The point is to depict what could be. Bodies that refuse the binary, desire that escapes category, beauty that makes people uncomfortable because they cannot quite name what they are looking at." You asked if he was afraid of prosecution. His work was certainly provocative enough to attract legal attention. He shrugged. "I am dying anyway. What can they do to me that tuberculosis is not already doing?" Beardsley died 3 years later in France, only 25 years old. But his images survived, reproduced in secret editions, passed between collectors, influencing generations of queer artists who saw in his work a vision of beauty that had nothing to do with heterosexual norms. The younger generation arriving in Brighton in the 1890s was different from yours. They had grown up in the shadow of the wild trials, which meant they had fewer illusions about safety, but also more explicit awareness of queer identity as a category. Words were beginning to circulate. Uranian from the poets' circles, invert from the medical literature. Even the German term homosexual which appeared in English sexology texts in the mid-1890s. You were not entirely sure how you felt about these words. On one hand, having language meant having a way to name yourself, to find others, to understand that you were part of a category rather than simply an isolated aberration. On the other hand, the language came with baggage, medical pathology, legal categories, the sense that loving men was a condition to be studied rather than simply a way of being human. You and William talked about this one evening after meeting a pair of young men at Robert's studio, both of whom had used the word invert to describe themselves with a kind of defiant pride. "I am not inverted," William said, frowning. "I am simply myself. I happen to love you. That does not make me a medical curiosity." You agreed, but you also saw the appeal. At least they have a word. When we were young, we had nothing. No language, no framework, no sense that others existed. Maybe having a word, even an imperfect one, is better than silence. William was not convinced, but he let it drop. You were both too old to get invested in debates about terminology. You had survived without words. The next generation would figure out their own vocabulary. The economic reality of queer life in Victorian Brighton deserves attention because it shaped who could access the town's relative safety. Brighton was not cheap. Rent was higher than in most English towns because of the resort economy. Food cost more. Entertainment cost more. The entire town ran on disposable income from visitors, and locals paid the inflated prices year-round. This meant that working-class gay men had limited access to Brighton's protections. A factory worker from Manchester might dream of moving to Brighton, but unless he had skills that translated to the resort economy, service work, entertainment, trades, he could not afford to live there. Brighton's queer community was disproportionately middle class and upper class as a result. Teachers, journalists, artists, retired military officers, men of independent means, people who could afford privacy. Working-class queer men existed in Brighton, certainly. They worked in the hotels, the restaurants, the stables, the fishing industry, but they lived in different neighbourhoods, had access to different networks, and faced different risks. A hotel worker caught in a compromising situation could be fired and lose his housing simultaneously. A gentleman caught in the same situation might face scandal, but would not face homelessness. You were aware of this disparity, but did not know how to address it. You were not wealthy, tutoring paid modestly, but you had enough. You owned no property, but you could afford rent. You could hire a maid to come twice a week. You could buy books. You were insulated from the kind of economic precarity that made survival impossible. One winter, you tried to help. A young man named Peter, who worked at one of the seafront hotels, had been dismissed after a manager accused him of inappropriate behaviour with a male guest. The accusation was almost certainly true, but Peter was now without work and nearly out of money. Someone in the network asked if you could take him in temporarily. Peter stayed with you for 3 months. He was 19, terrified and angry in the way young people are when they realise the world is fundamentally unfair. He had grown up in Brighton, the son of a fisherman, and he had thought that because Brighton was tolerant, he would be safe. He had not understood that tolerance was conditional on class and discretion. You helped him find new work, eventually, at a smaller hotel where the manager was more pragmatic. But the experience shook you. Peter's vulnerability was so much greater than yours had ever been. If you lost your tutoring income, you had savings. You had William's income. You had friends who would help. Peter had none of that. He had only the network, and the network was fragile. After Peter left, William said quietly, "We have been extraordinarily lucky, not just in finding each other, in having enough money that we could build a life. Most men do not have that." You nodded. Luck and class were impossible to separate. Brighton's relationship with its gay residents was never officially acknowledged, but it shaped the town's identity in subtle ways. By the 1890s, Brighton had a reputation across England as a place where unconventional people could live unconventional lives. This reputation attracted not just gay men, but divorcees, artists, religious nonconformists, and anyone else who felt constrained by Victorian propriety elsewhere. The town's economy benefited from this reputation. Unconventional people tended to have disposable income and interesting social circles. They patronized the arts. They filled the cafes and the concert halls. They made Brighton feel cosmopolitan in a way that attracted even more visitors. The town's tolerance was not altruism, it was good business. But business logic still protected people. A hotel that refused to rent rooms to male couples would lose customers. A landlord who evicted long-term tenants for moral reasons would struggle to fill the vacancy. Economic incentives and social tolerance aligned just enough to create space. You saw this play out in small ways throughout your decades in Brighton. Shopkeepers who greeted you and William as a unit, offering discounts to you gentlemen as if you were an established household. Theatre managers who sold you seats together without comment. Even the bank, where you and William maintained a joint account under the fiction that you were business partners, never questioned the arrangement as long as the balance stayed positive. These small institutional accommodations added up to a life that felt almost normal. Almost. The question of what you would leave behind began to preoccupy you as you aged. You had no children, no direct descendants. Your families in London had long since stopped expecting you to return, and your contact with them had dwindled to occasional letters that grew more perfunctory each year. When you died, there would be no one to carry forward your name or your story. This bothered you less than you expected. You had never wanted conventional legacy. But you did want some proof that your life had meant something, that the love you and William had built together would not simply evaporate the moment you were both gone. You started writing things down. Not a diary. That would be too dangerous. But fragments. Descriptions of Brighton as it had been when you arrived. Lists of the friends you had made and lost. Small domestic details that seemed important to preserve. The way William took his tea. The route of your Sunday walks. The roses in the back garden and how many years it took to get them to bloom properly. You hid these pages in the false bottom of a trunk, along with a few photographs, and the handful of letters you could not bear to burn. You did not know if anyone would ever find them. You did not know if they would mean anything to whoever did. But you wrote them anyway, a message in a bottle tossed into the future. William found you writing one evening and asked what you were doing. Leaving evidence, you said. He understood immediately. He sat down and started writing his own pages. By the late 1890s, you had both slowed considerably. William's hands ached constantly from arthritis, and his eyesight was failing. You had developed a persistent cough that the doctor could not quite diagnose, but treated with syrups that did nothing. You still walked, but shorter distances now, and you rested more frequently. The Sunday walks to Rottingdean became Sunday walks to the far end of the promenade and back. Your social circle had contracted. Many of the men you had known in the 1860s and 1870s were dead. Robert the painter had died in 1896. Edward, your first friend in Brighton, had died in 1893. Charlotte was gone. Arthur, the young man you had sheltered in 1883, had sent word from Paris that he was ill and not expected to recover. The network was still there, but its nodes were fewer, and the connections felt more fragile. New men arrived, of course. The network regenerated itself, but you were no longer at the center of it. You were becoming the old guard, the men who had been here forever, the institutional memory. Younger men came to you with questions about how things used to work, how the community had survived before the wild trials, whether it had ever been easier. You told them the truth. It had never been easy, but it had been possible, and that was enough. One afternoon in 1899, a man in his 20s named Leonard appeared at your door with an introduction from a mutual acquaintance. Leonard had just moved to Brighton from Birmingham and was looking for guidance. You invited him in for tea, and over the course of 2 hours, you explained the geography of queer Brighton as you understood it, the safe spaces and the dangerous ones, the people who could be trusted and the ones who could not. the unspoken rules that kept the community alive. Leonard listened carefully, taking mental notes. When you finished, he asked, "Is it always this complicated?" You considered the question. Yes, but you get used to the complications, and eventually, the life you build becomes more important than the difficulty of building it. Leonard thanked you and left. You watched him walk down the street toward the seafront, his shoulders a little straighter than when he had arrived, and you felt something shift. You had just passed the knowledge forward. The network would continue. Brighton would still be here for the next generation, imperfect and conditional, but present. That night, you told William about the conversation. "We are becoming history," he said, not quite joking. "We have always been history," you replied. "We just did not know it yet." The archive problem haunted you more as the years passed. Every letter you burned, every photograph you destroyed, every careful erasure you performed to protect yourselves also erased proof that you had existed. Future generations would look back at Victorian England and see only the prosecution records, the medical pathologies, the scandals. They would not see the quiet houses in Kemp Town where men grew old together. They would not see the Sunday walks, the shared meals, the arguments about whose turn it was to deal with the coal delivery. The historian in the future would find gaps in the record and assume nothing had existed in those gaps. They would not know that the gaps were intentional, carved out by people trying to survive. You thought about this often when you sorted through papers deciding what to keep and what to burn. A letter from William written during one of his rare trips to London, tender, explicit, dangerous. You read it one last time, memorizing the particular way he had signed it. Yours entirely, in this life and whatever follows. Then you fed it to the fire. The paper curled and blackened, and the words disappeared. No one would ever read that letter again. No one would ever know what William had written to you in 1873, how he had promised to return quickly because the house felt empty without you. But keeping it meant risking both your reputations if it were found after your deaths. So you burned it, and you burned dozens like it, and each one felt like a small death. Some things you kept. The photograph of the two of you taken on the West Pier in 1881, carefully composed to look like a picture of friends, not lovers. Both of you are standing stiffly, not touching, facing the camera with the studied neutrality that 19th century photography required. But if you look closely at William's face, you can see the smallest smile at the corner of his mouth, the one he always got when he was trying not to laugh. You were keeping that photograph. Let future scholars make of it what they would. You kept the ticket stubs from the concerts you had attended together, a whole collection of them pressed into a book. Proof that you had been places, done things, existed in public space, even if the nature of your relationship had to stay private. The stubs were innocuous. Anyone could have kept them. But together they formed a pattern. The same two people, sitting together at concerts for 30 years, side by side. You kept the guest book from the dinner parties you had hosted, carefully noting who had attended each gathering. The names would mean nothing to outsiders, but anyone looking closely would notice that the same names appeared repeatedly, and that they were almost all men, and that some of those men had lived at the same addresses for suspiciously long periods. It was not explicit evidence, but it was evidence. William contributed his own archive materials, drafts of articles he had written for the Brighton Gazette, some of them containing carefully coded references to the town's bohemian character and its reputation for welcoming those who lived differently. His editors had let these phrases through, probably without fully understanding their meaning, or perhaps understanding perfectly and choosing not to care. One article from 1889 was particularly bold. William had written a piece about Brighton's history as a refuge, ostensibly about political refugees and religious dissenters who had found safety in the town over the centuries. But the language worked on two levels. Those who loved differently than the law allowed appeared in the text, technically referring to interfaith marriages. but the phrasing was deliberate. William had threaded a queer reading into the public record, hidden in plain sight. "Do you think anyone will catch it?" you had asked when he showed you the draft. "Not now," he had said, "but maybe someday, someone will read it and understand what I meant." The article was published. It appeared in the newspaper, was read by hundreds of people, and then disappeared into the archives. You kept a clipping. Someday, maybe, someone would find it and hear the echo. The physical landscape of Brighton carried its own archive, though you did not think of it that way at the time. The houses where men had lived together would survive long after the men themselves were gone. The streets you had walked would still be there. The sea would still crash against the shingle beach. Future visitors to Brighton would inhabit the same geography you had, not knowing that their tourist stroll along the seafront followed the exact route where generations of gay men had cruised, met, fallen in love. You liked the idea that the geography itself was a kind of memory, that even if all the documents were destroyed, the place would remain, and the place knew what had happened there. Walking through Brighton in 1900 was an exercise in layered memory. You passed the boarding house where you had first stayed in 1856, now repainted but structurally unchanged. You passed the bookshop where you had met William. It had closed in 1892, replaced by a tobacconist, but you could still see the outline of the old sign if you knew where to look. You passed the pub where you had first heard rumours of safe houses, still operating under the same name, but with different management now. Every street held ghosts, not supernatural ones, but the accumulated presence of everyone who had walked there before, everyone who had made the same careful calculations about safety and visibility, everyone who had loved in the margins and survived. You wondered sometimes what the city would look like if all those lives were visible simultaneously. If you could see every gay man who had ever lived in Brighton overlaid on the present landscape. The streets would be crowded with ghosts, all of them walking arm in arm, all of them living lives that history refused to record. But you could not see them. You could only know they had existed because you existed, and you were not unique. You were simply one of thousands, most of whom left no trace except their presence in census records filed under lodger. The turn of the century felt symbolically weighted, even though you knew dates were arbitrary. Queen Victoria was dying. The Victorian era was ending. The 20th century was beginning, and no one knew what it would bring. Optimists talked about progress, technology, social reform. Pessimists talked about the fracturing of traditional values and the chaos that would follow. You were neither optimistic nor pessimistic. You were simply tired. Your health had declined noticeably in the past year. The cough that had been occasional was now constant, and you had lost weight. The doctor used words like consumption and decline and suggested you might be more comfortable somewhere warmer and drier. You thanked him and ignored the advice. You were not leaving Brighton. You were not leaving William. If you were going to die, you would die here, in the town that had let you live. William's health was no better. His arthritis had progressed to the point where he could barely hold a pen, and his breathing was laboured after even short walks. You had both reached the stage where daily life required constant adaptation. Tasks that had once been automatic now needed planning. Getting dressed took longer. Stairs required rest breaks. Simple errands became exhausting. But you managed. You helped each other. William buttoned your shirts when your hands shook too badly. You read aloud to him when his eyes could no longer track the page. You had developed a system of mutual dependence that worked precisely because you both needed help and could both provide it. The young man, Leonard, began visiting regularly, bringing groceries and news from the wider community. He had found work at a bookshop and a place to live with another young man named Richard. They were building the same kind of life you and William had built 40 years earlier, making the same compromises, navigating the same dangers. Leonard asked questions constantly. He wanted to know everything about how you had survived, what strategies had worked, what you would have done differently. You answered as honestly as you could, though you suspected your answers were not always helpful. The world Leonard was entering was different from the one you had navigated. Laws were changing. Attitudes were shifting, though not always in favourable directions. The strategies that had worked in 1860 might not work in 1900. The key, you told him during one visit, is to build networks you can trust absolutely. Because when the danger comes, and it will come at some point, the only thing that will save you is other people who care whether you survive. Leonard wrote that down, literally pulled out a notebook and wrote it down. You were startled. "Are you keeping records?" you asked, suddenly nervous. "Just notes," Leonard said. "Things I do not want to forget. I will be careful with them." You understood the impulse, even as you worried about the risk. Leonard was trying to do what you had failed to do. Create a record that would survive, that would tell future generations something true about what it had been like. "Burn them if you ever feel unsafe," you said. "The knowledge is not worth your freedom." Leonard nodded, but you could tell he was not entirely convinced. The young never believed they would be caught. The rhythm of days became slower and smaller. You woke later, you moved less. Your world contracted to the house, the back garden, occasionally the end of the street. The expansive walks of your earlier years were impossible now, but the contraction was not entirely unwelcome. There was something peaceful about letting the world shrink to just the essential things. William, the house, the light coming through the windows, the sound of the sea. You still read, though your eyes tired quickly. William still wrote when his hands allowed, though his output had reduced to a few sentences a day. You still talked, long, rambling conversations about everything and nothing, the kind of talk that only happens between people who have known each other so long that half the sentences do not need finishing. One evening, sitting in the back parlour with the lamps lit against the autumn dark, William said, "I have been thinking about what we should be called." You looked up from your book. "Called?" "Future people will need words for what we were. I have been thinking about what words would be accurate." You considered this. "Partners," you said. "We were partners." "Too vague," William said. "Business partners are partners. We were more specific than that." "Lovers," you tried. "True but incomplete. We were also housemates, companions, best friends, co-conspirators in the project of staying alive." You smiled. "That is too many words." "Maybe we need too many words," William said. "Maybe one word cannot hold what we were to each other." The conversation stayed with you. He was right that the available language was inadequate. Husband implied a legal relationship you had never had. Lover emphasized the sexual dimension to the exclusion of everything else. Friend minimized the depth. Partner was better but still somehow insufficient. What you had been to each other was simply what you had been. Two people who had chosen each other every day for 44 years, who had built a life in the margins of a society that refused to acknowledge that life could exist. There was no word for that because society had not wanted the word to exist. But you had existed anyway. The absence of language had not prevented the reality. Winter came early in 1900, and it was brutal. Snow fell in November, rare for Brighton, and the temperature dropped below freezing for weeks. The house was difficult to heat. Your cough worsened. William developed a fever that would not break. You nursed each other as best you could, but you were both too ill to be effective caregivers. Leonard found you both in bad shape during one of his visits and immediately fetched the doctor. The doctor examined you both, his face grave, and recommended bed rest, warm liquids, and someone to look after you. Leonard volunteered. He moved into the spare room temporarily and took over the practical tasks, building fires, cooking simple meals, making sure you both took the medicines the doctor prescribed. You were embarrassed to need this help, but you were also grateful. Without Leonard, you were not sure either of you would have survived that winter. During the worst of it, when you were both confined to bed and too weak to do much beyond sleep and occasionally talk, You had a conversation that felt important, even though you could barely muster the energy for it. "If I die first," William said, his voice hoarse, "you need to burn everything. The trunk with the papers, the photographs, all of it. Do not let my family come here and find anything that could hurt you. The same for you," you said. "If I go first, destroy it all. Protect yourself." You both knew this was the practical course, but it also meant that everything you had tried to preserve, all the small archives you had built, would likely be destroyed. One of you would die first, that was statistical certainty, and the survivor would spend his remaining energy erasing all evidence of what had existed. The thought was almost unbearable. 44 years reduced to ash because survival required it. "Maybe we should burn it all now," you said, "while we are both still here. At least then we could do it together." William was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Not yet. Let us survive this winter first. If we are both still alive in spring, we can decide then." You agreed. Spring felt impossibly far away, but you held on to it as a goal. You did survive the winter, both of you, though it was close. By March, you were both well enough to sit up, to move around the house, to begin resuming something like normal life. Leonard returned to his own lodgings, but continued to visit several times a week, checking on you with the kind of care that made you think he understood exactly how fragile you both were. The papers in the trunk stayed unburned. You could not bring yourself to destroy them, and William did not push. Some part of both of you still hoped that maybe, somehow, they could survive beyond you. Spring brought a small resurgence of energy. You could walk to the end of the street again. William could sit in the back garden and watch the roses beginning to leaf out. The world felt less hostile when the sun was shining and the temperature was above freezing. On one of the first genuinely warm days in April, you and William managed a short walk together, just to the corner and back, but it felt like a victory. You stood outside your front door afterward, both of you breathing hard from the exertion, and William said, "We are still here. We are still here," you agreed. It became a kind of mantra. On difficult days, when the fear crept back in, or the physical pain was too much, or the weight of everything felt overwhelming, one of you would say it. "We are still here." It was not optimism exactly. It was just fact. You had survived another day, another week, another year. You were still here. The correspondence you maintained with other members of the scattered queer network revealed how unusual your longevity was. Most of the men you had known in the 1860s were dead. Many had died young, from illness, from suicide, from the direct and indirect consequences of prosecution and social ostracism. A few had made it into their 50s. Almost none had made it into their 60s. You and William were both in your mid-60s now, and you were still together. That alone was remarkable. A letter arrived from Paris in the spring of 1900, from a man named Michel, who had been part of the expatriate community there for decades. Michel had known several of the men who had passed through your house over the years, and he wrote occasionally to maintain the connection. This letter was different. Michel was dying, and he knew it. He was writing to say goodbye. In the letter, Michel reflected on his life in Paris, the lovers he had had, the community he had found, the relative freedom of French law compared to English law. But then he wrote something that struck you. "I have lived in a city that tolerated me, but I always envied you and William for living in a place that felt like home. Paris has been safety, but it has never been home. I have always been an exile here. You managed to build something permanent in the country of your birth, and that is extraordinary. Do not underestimate what you have done." You showed the letter to William. He read it slowly, his eyes moving over the lines multiple times. "Do you think we built something permanent?" he asked. You looked around the room, the books, the furniture, the small accumulation of decades. "We built something," you said. "I do not know if it is permanent, but we built it." Michel died 3 weeks later. The letter was the last thing he wrote, and you kept it. Adding it to the trunk with the other fragments of evidence that you and William had existed, had mattered to someone, had been part of a larger community that spanned cities and countries. The question of legacy came up again that summer during a visit from Leonard and Richard. The four of you sat in the back garden, drinking weak tea in the afternoon sun, and Leonard asked what you wanted people to remember about Brighton's queer history. You had never been asked this so directly. You thought about it while watching bees work through the roses William had coaxed into blooming. "I want people to know it was possible," you said finally. "Not easy, not safe, not ideal, but possible. I want them to know that men built lives together, even when the law said they could not. That we loved each other, that we survived. And I want them to know that it was not just grand tragic romance. It was also laundry and grocery shopping, and arguments about nothing, and growing old together. The boring parts, the ordinary parts, those matter too." William added, "And I want them to know that places like Brighton existed, that there were refuges, even if they were imperfect, that not everyone was caught, not everyone was destroyed. Some of us lived." Richard, who had been quiet until now, said, "I hope they remember the people who helped, the landladies who did not ask questions, the neighbours who brought soup, the doctors who wrote discreet notes in their records, all the straight people who could have turned us in and chose not to. That was true too. Your survival had depended on the active assistance and passive tolerance of hundreds of people over the years. They were part of the story as much as you were." Leonard wrote all of this down in his notebook. You still worried about the notebook, but you also hoped it would survive. Someone needed to remember. As summer turned to autumn in 1900, you felt time pressing more heavily. Both of you were declining again, slowly but unmistakably. You tired more easily. You slept more. The boundaries of your world contracted further. Some days you made it to the garden. Some days you did not leave the house. Some days you barely left bed. But you were together. That remained true. Whatever was coming, you would face it side by side, exactly as you had faced everything else for 44 years. One evening in October, as you sat in the back parlour watching the light fade, William reached over and took your hand. His grip was weak, his skin thin and papery, but the gesture was the same as it had always been. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For staying. For building this with me. For 44 years of choosing me every single day." Your throat tightened. "I would choose you again," you said. "Every time. In every life." He smiled. That same smile you had fallen in love with in a bookshop in 1856. And for a moment he looked young again, full of possibility and hope. Then the moment passed, and he was just William, 66 years old, dying slowly in a seaside town that had let him live. But he was yours, and you were his. And Brighton, imperfect and conditional as its protection had been, had given you that. The rest was just time. The mechanics of dying together were never discussed in the romantic literature about love between men. The Greek poems celebrated eternal devotion. The Renaissance sonnets praised beauty and longing. But no one wrote instructions for what happened when two men who had lived as partners for decades both reached the end simultaneously, with no legal recognition, no family support, and no social framework to hold the grief. You and William figured it out as you went. The first decision was medical. The doctor who had treated you both for years had died in 1899, and his replacement was younger, less familiar with your household arrangement. When this new doctor made his first house call and found both of you ill, he asked where your families were, why no wives or children were caring for you. William, with the kind of boldness that only comes from having nothing left to lose, said simply, "We are each other's family. We have been for 44 years. That will have to be sufficient." The doctor blinked. He looked at William. He looked at you. He looked around the room, the two chairs positioned close together, the shared bookshelf, the decades of accumulated domestic life that could not be explained away as mere lodging. "I see," he said finally, and then to his credit, he asked no further questions. He examined you both, prescribed medications, and left instructions that were addressed to both of you equally, as if you were a recognized unit. When he returned the following week, he asked how you both were managing, and the phrasing was deliberate. Small mercies. They accumulated like snow. The second decision was financial. You had savings, but not enough for extended illness. William's pension from his years at the Gazette was modest. Your tutoring income had ended when you became too ill to work. The mathematics were clear. You could afford perhaps another year of rent and basic expenses if nothing unexpected happened. After that, you would need to rely on charity or the workhouse. Neither option was acceptable. The workhouse would separate you. Charity would come with moral scrutiny. You discussed this in the practical tones you had learned to use when fear threatened to overwhelm planning. "We sell what we can," William said. "The furniture we do not need, the books we can bear to part with. We make the money last as long as possible." You agreed. Over the next months, pieces of your life were sold to second-hand dealers. The pianoforte went first. Neither of you could play it anymore anyway. Then the extra chairs, the good china, the paintings from the walls. Each sale felt like a small amputation, but each sale also bought time. Leonard helped with the negotiations, bargaining with dealers to get fair prices. He brought money from the sales in careful accounting, every penny documented. You tried to pay him for his time, but he refused. "You gave me a place to start," he said. "This is what I can give back." The network functioned like this. Debts were repaid across decades, across generations. You had sheltered men in the 1880s who would never be able to repay you directly. Leonard was repaying them by helping you now. Someday, when Leonard was old, someone younger would help him, completing the cycle. Winter returned, and with it the cold that made everything harder. Your world had contracted to 3 rooms now: the bedroom you shared, the back parlour where you spent days when you were strong enough to get out of bed, and the kitchen where Leonard prepared simple meals neither of you ate enough of. The front parlour sat unused, furniture sold, dust accumulating. You stopped heating it to save coal. The house felt like it was slowly being abandoned, even while you still lived in it. But the bedroom remained warm. Leonard made sure of that. He built the fire every morning and banked it every evening. The room became your entire universe. Familiar walls, familiar light, the window overlooking the small back garden where snow covered the dormant roses. You and William spent hours in that room simply being together. Sometimes you talked. Sometimes William read aloud from books you both knew by heart, his voice thin but steady. Sometimes you just held hands across the narrow space between the twin beds Leonard had helped you bring upstairs, when the stairs became too difficult to manage daily. Twin beds, the compromise of late illness. You could no longer share a bed safely. You both moved too much in the night, and the risk of falls was too high. But the beds were positioned so close together that you could reach out and touch each other. Most nights, you fell asleep holding hands, and most mornings, you woke the same way. The indignity of physical decline was something no one prepared you for. You had imagined dying would be dramatic, perhaps painful, but essentially quick. Instead, it was slow and incremental, and often humiliating. You needed help with tasks you had performed independently your entire adult life. Leonard or Richard, who now visited on alternate days, helped with washing, dressing, using the chamber pot when the stairs to the water closet were impossible. You apologized constantly at first. Leonard told you to stop. "This is what love looks like at the end," he said simply. "Bodies fail. People help. It is not shameful. It is just what happens." You tried to believe him. William handled the indignity better than you did, perhaps because he had always been more practical about physical reality. When he could no longer button his own shirts, he simply accepted Leonard's help and moved on. When he needed assistance to the chamber pot, he thanked Richard and did not dwell on it. He had decided that preserving dignity meant not letting shame consume the time he had left, and he stuck to that decision with impressive consistency. You tried to follow his example. Some days you managed. Some days you did not. The community beyond your house continued, and news filtered in through Leonard and Richard. The networks were still functioning, still adapting to new pressures and new possibilities. A new generation was arriving in Brighton, men in their 20s who had grown up after the wild trials and had different reference points, different language, different strategies. Some of them knew about you and William, in the vague way that institutional memory worked. The old couple who had been together forever, the ones who had survived. Leonard brought one of these younger men to meet you in early 1901, a journalist named Thomas who was writing, very carefully, very obliquely, about Brighton's history of tolerance. Thomas sat in the back parlour and asked questions that were never quite direct, but whose meaning was clear. How had you managed to stay in one place for so long? What had made Brighton safer than other cities? How had the networks operated? You answered as honestly as you could without providing information that could be used against anyone still living. You talked about the economics of tolerance, the importance of discretion, the role of sympathetic individuals in positions of minor authority. You talked about the landladies and the doctors and the policemen who had looked the other way at crucial moments. Thomas took notes in shorthand, and you wondered if anything you said would survive into whatever he eventually published. Probably not in explicit form, but maybe in implication, in the careful architecture of what he chose to include and exclude. Future readers would understand what he meant. After Thomas left, William said, "We are becoming historical sources. That is deeply strange." You laughed, which turned into a cough that took several minutes to subside. When you finally caught your breath, you said, "At least someone is asking while we are still alive to answer." That night, you thought about all the men who had not been asked, who had died without anyone recording their stories, whose lives existed now only as gaps in the archives. You had been lucky again. Lucky to survive long enough to be worth asking about. The question of what would happen when one of you died had been theoretical for years. In the spring of 1901, it became urgent. William's breathing was increasingly laboured, and he had developed a persistent chest infection that the doctor could not clear. He slept sitting up because lying flat made the breathing worse. He ate almost nothing. His skin took on a greyish cast that you recognised from other deaths you had witnessed. You asked the doctor, privately, how long William had. "Weeks," the doctor said quietly. "Perhaps a month or two if he is very strong." "I am sorry." You thanked him and returned upstairs. That evening, you told William what the doctor had said. He nodded as if he had already known. "We need to finalise things," he said. "The papers in the trunk. What you will tell people. Where I should be buried." You had been avoiding this conversation for months, but he was right. It needed to happen. You talked through the night, making plans. The papers would be burned. You both agreed that protecting you after his death was more important than preserving evidence. He wanted to be buried in the extramural cemetery where you had purchased adjacent plots years ago. The headstone should be simple, just his name and dates. No epitaph that could raise questions. "And you need to tell people I was your friend," William said. "Your very dear friend and longtime housemate. Nothing more specific than that. Protect yourself." You nodded, though the thought of reducing 44 years to dear friend felt like erasure. "After you die," you said, "I will not be far behind. We both know that. So the deception will not need to hold for very long." William took your hand. "Still, promise me you will be careful. I do not want my death to destroy you legally or socially." You promised. The next weeks were a vigil. You barely left William's side. Leonard and Richard managed the household, brought food, dealt with tradesmen. You sat in the chair beside William's bed and read to him when he was awake, held his hand when he slept, monitored his breathing for changes. The network showed up in quiet ways. Men you had known for decades stopped by briefly, ostensibly to check on you both, actually to say goodbye to William. They did not stay long. William tired easily, but they came. A painter brought a small watercolour of the seafront. A former journalist brought a book of poetry. An elderly man who had arrived in Brighton in the 1860s just sat holding William's hand for 20 minutes without speaking, then left. These visits were the community's way of marking William's importance, of saying he had mattered, he had been part of something larger than himself. They were also the community's way of showing you that you would not be alone after he died. One afternoon, when William was having a better day and was able to sit up and speak clearly, he asked you to describe the view from the window. His eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer see the garden clearly. You described it in detail. The roses were beginning to bud, early pink blooms pushing through despite the late frost. The small patch of lawn was greening. A robin was building a nest in the eaves. The sky was that particular bright spring blue that only happened after rain. William listened with his eyes closed, and when you finished, he said, "I am glad we planted those roses. They were a pain to establish, but they were worth it." You agreed. The roses had been worth it. He died 3 days later in the early morning, with you holding his hand. His breathing had become increasingly irregular through the night, and then it simply stopped. One moment he was there, struggling for air. The next moment he was gone. You sat with him for a long time before calling for Leonard. You needed those hours alone with his body, needed to memorize his face without the strain of breathing, needed to say things you had never said aloud while he lived. You told him he had been the best part of your life. You told him that every day with him had been worth every risk. You told him you were grateful beyond words for 44 years of choosing each other. Then you called for Leonard, and the machinery of death began. The doctor came and certified the death. Natural causes, respiratory failure. The undertaker came and removed the body. You signed papers, made arrangements, moved through the tasks with mechanical efficiency while feeling nothing. The funeral was small. A handful of men from the community attended, all of them carefully dressed in respectable mourning, all of them maintaining the fiction that they were simply friends and acquaintances of the deceased. The vicar who performed the service had no idea who William had actually been to you. He delivered generic words about a life well lived, a man who would be missed. You stood at the graveside and listened to lies, and you said nothing to correct them because correction would destroy you. After the funeral, you returned to the house that was no longer your shared home, but just your house now. Leonard had already removed William's bed, thinking to spare you the pain of seeing it empty. But the absence was worse. The room looked unbalanced with only one bed. You asked Leonard to bring the bed back. You needed to see where William had slept, even if he would never sleep there again. The grief was physical. Your chest hurt, your throat hurt. Your entire body felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with broken glass. You could not eat. You could not sleep except in brief, fitful periods. You moved through the house like a ghost, touching objects William had touched, sitting in chairs William had sat in, trying to feel his presence in the spaces he had occupied. The community visited daily, bringing food you did not eat, sitting with you in silence, making sure you were still breathing. Richard read to you from the books you and William had read together. Leonard handled the correspondence, the bills, the practical matters you could not focus on. You opened the trunk one evening, intending to burn the papers as you had promised William. But you could not do it. Not yet. You needed them. They were all that remained of proof that William had loved you, that you had loved him, that 44 years had meant something. You would burn them eventually. But not yet. The weeks after William's death blurred together. You lost track of days. You stopped getting dressed unless Leonard insisted. You sat in the back parlour staring at nothing, or you lay in bed staring at the empty bed across from yours. People told you that grief would ease with time. You did not believe them. The pain felt permanent, structural, like a weight that would press down on you until you stopped breathing too. But the body is stubborn about survival. Despite your grief, despite your wish to simply stop existing, you kept waking up each morning. You kept breathing. Your heart kept beating. The physical machinery of life continued whether you wanted it to or not. Leonard moved into the house full-time after the 3rd week, worried that you would hurt yourself or simply stop eating entirely. He cooked meals and sat with you while you picked at them. He read aloud when you could not bear silence. He talked about inconsequential things, the weather, the news, small gossip from the community, just to fill the air with sound. One evening, about 6 weeks after William's death, you asked Leonard why he was doing this. "Because someone did it for me," he said simply. "When I first arrived in Brighton, terrified and alone, people I barely knew took me in, made sure I ate, made sure I did not do anything stupid. I am repaying that debt." You understood. The network functioned like this. Care circulated through it, passed forward across time, given freely because it had been received freely. "Thank you," you said quietly. Leonard nodded. "Also," he added, You and William gave me hope that this life was livable, that two men could actually build something lasting. I need you to survive, because if you do not, it means the hope was false. That landed differently. You had not thought of your survival as mattering to anyone except yourself. But Leonard was right. You and William had been proof of possibility for younger men. Your continued existence, even in grief, was part of that proof. You tried harder after that conversation. You ate more. You got out of bed. You walked slowly through the house, relearning how to inhabit space alone. The financial situation was dire. Without William's pension, you had only the remnants of savings. You calculated carefully and concluded you had perhaps 3 months before you would be completely destitute. The house would have to go. You would need to find a single room somewhere cheaper, sell the remaining furniture, live as minimally as possible. Leonard and Richard offered to help financially, but you refused. They had their own lives to build, their own precarious survival to maintain. You would not drain their resources, but you also knew you did not have much time. Your own health was failing rapidly now. The grief had accelerated the physical decline. You coughed blood. You had chest pains. You could barely walk to the end of the street without needing to rest. The doctor confirmed what you already knew. You were dying. Consumption, heart strain, the accumulated damage of a hard life. Months at most. You were relieved. The prospect of dying was less frightening than the prospect of living decades without William. You would follow him soon. That felt right. You began organizing what remained. You burned most of the papers from the trunk, feeding them to the fire page by page, watching decades of evidence turn to ash. You kept only a few items: the photograph from the West Pier, William's last letter to you, the ticket stubs from concerts. Those would be buried with you. You sold the house contents systematically, keeping only what you needed for the time you had left. Leonard helped arrange the sales and manage the money. You moved to a single room in a cheaper boarding house, a space barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but sufficient for dying. The community visited you there. The room was too small for gatherings, so they came 1 or 2 at a time, sitting in the single chair while you lay in bed, talking quietly, or just being present. Thomas the journalist visited one last time in the summer of 1901, bringing a draft of the article he had written about Brighton's history of tolerance. He read portions aloud to you, carefully constructed sentences that meant 2 things simultaneously, one meaning for the general reader, another for those who knew how to listen. He had written about the town's tradition of welcoming artistic unconventionality and domestic arrangements outside the traditional family structure. He had written about the economic incentives for tolerance and the network of sympathetic professionals who had enabled people to live differently. He had written, in carefully coded language, about exactly what you had described to him months earlier. "It will be published in September," Thomas said, "in a small arts journal. Not many people will read it, but the right people will." You thanked him. The article would not mention you or William by name, but you would be there in it, ghosts in the margins of the historical record. Someone in the future might read between the lines and understand what Thomas was really documenting. After Thomas left, you thought about the concept of historical record itself. What survived and what vanished, whose stories were preserved and whose were erased. You and William had tried to live invisibly, to leave no trace that could be used against you, and you had largely succeeded. But invisibility meant that future generations might never know you had existed at all. The tension was irresolvable. Visibility meant danger. Invisibility meant erasure. There was no safe path that also led to remembrance. But perhaps the physical landscape would remember, even if the documents did not. The house in Kemptown, where you had lived for 30 years, still stood. The streets you had walked were still there. The cemetery where William was buried would remain. Future gay men would inhabit the same geography, walk the same routes, live in the same neighborhoods, not knowing they were following paths worn smooth by generations before them. That was a kind of memory, imperfect, wordless, but present. Leonard visited every day now. He brought books and read aloud when you were too weak to read yourself. He brought news from the community, who was arriving in Brighton, who was leaving, the small dramas and celebrations that constituted daily life. He was trying to keep you connected to the world, even as you felt yourself detaching from it. One afternoon in late August, you asked Leonard what he would remember about you and William. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I will remember that you survived," he said finally. "That you built something that lasted. That you showed me it was possible to grow old with someone you loved. That is not a small thing." You smiled. It was not a small thing. "And I will remember the small details," Leonard continued. "The way William made tea. The way you argued about which route to take on walks. The roses in your garden. The specific way you looked at each other when you thought no one was watching. Those details matter as much as the survival." He was right. The small details were the texture of a life, and texture was what made history feel real rather than abstract. You died on September 12, 1901, 3 months after William, with Leonard sitting beside your bed holding your hand. Your last conscious thought was relief. You were going to wherever William had gone, and you would not have to be separated anymore. Leonard arranged the funeral, a small service attended by the same men who had attended William's funeral. You were buried in the plot next to William, the headstones simple and identical, except for the names and dates. To a casual observer, 2 men who had lived and died in the same small corner of Brighton. Nothing remarkable, but the men who attended your funeral knew better. They understood what those 2 graves represented. 44 years of love that had survived despite everything. A partnership that had lasted longer than most Victorian marriages. 2 lives so intertwined that one could not survive long without the other. After the funeral, Leonard and Richard walked back to their lodgings along the seafront. The September light was golden, the sea calm, the promenade crowded with tourists enjoying the late summer weather. "They made it," Richard said quietly, "all the way to the end, together. That is what I will remember." Leonard nodded. He was carrying the few items you had kept from the trunk, the photograph, the letter, the ticket stubs. He would hide them carefully, preserve them if he could, pass them forward if the opportunity arose. Maybe someday someone would find them and understand what they represented. The story of you and William became part of the oral history of queer Brighton, passed between men in whispered conversations and coded references. The old couple who had lived in Kemp Town for decades, the ones who had survived the wild trials and the moral panics and all the small accumulated dangers of being gay in Victorian England, the ones who had died within months of each other because neither could imagine life without the other. The story was not famous. It was not dramatic, but it circulated through the network as proof that survival was possible, that love could last, that men could build lives together even in the most hostile circumstances. And the network continued. New men arrived in Brighton every year, drawn by the same rumours and whispers that had drawn you in 1856. Some of them found safety. Some of them built partnerships that lasted decades. Some of them did not survive. But the town remained a refuge, imperfect and conditional, offering a slightly better chance than anywhere else in England. The houses in Kemp Town continued to shelter couples who called themselves lodgers. The landladies continued to accept rent without asking questions. The doctors continued to write discreet notes in their records. The network of tolerance that had allowed you and William to survive extended forward into the 20th century, adapting to new laws and new dangers but fundamentally unchanged in its basic operation. Brighton's role as a queer refuge would continue through both world wars, through the partial decriminalization of 1967, through the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, all the way to the present day when the town openly celebrates its LGBTQ history and identity. But the foundation was laid in the Victorian era by men like you and William, who simply refused to disappear. The historical record eventually caught up, though it took a century. Scholars working in the 1990s and 2000s began systematically studying the census records, the court documents, the private letters that had survived despite efforts to destroy them. They began mapping the geography of queer Victorian life, identifying the pubs and the boarding houses and the neighbourhoods where same-sex couples had clustered. Brighton appeared repeatedly in their research. The absence of prosecution records became itself a form of evidence. The unusual housing patterns in Kemp Town, the coded references in local newspapers, the oral histories passed down through generations of queer Brighton residents. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. This town had functioned as a refuge, and the refuge had saved lives. Your names were never recovered. The deliberate erasure you had performed to protect yourselves worked too well. But the pattern was there, and the pattern told the story even without the names. In 2004, a researcher named Matt Cook published a book about queer London in the long 19th century, and Brighton featured prominently in the analysis. Cook wrote about the economic factors that enabled tolerance, the networks of support that sustained queer communities, and the individual acts of courage that added up to survival. He wrote about unnamed couples who had lived together for decades, documented only by census entries and burial records. You and William were somewhere in that research. Not by name, but by shape. The outline of your lives visible in the historical record, like fossils in rock. In Brighton today, the house where you lived still stands, divided now into flats, occupied by people who have no idea of its history. The cemetery where you were buried is maintained by the city, your graves tended along with thousands of others. Tourists walk past them without noticing. But occasionally, someone stops. A scholar doing research, a queer person visiting Brighton's historical sites, someone who has learned to read the landscape for its hidden meanings. They see two graves, side by side, marked with names and dates, and nothing more. And they understand what is not written on the stone, that these two men loved each other in a time when that love was criminal, that they survived together, that they died within months of each other, because neither could bear to be alone. And standing there, looking at those graves, the visitor might feel a connection across time, the knowledge that we have always existed, that we have always found each other, that love has always found a way even in the darkest circumstances. The story of queer Brighton is not a story of triumph. The laws remained brutal. The persecution continued. Men were still arrested, still imprisoned, still destroyed for the crime of loving. Brighton's tolerance was always fragile, always conditional, always dependent on discretion and economic incentives, and the particular individuals in power at any given moment. But it was also a story of persistence, of the networks that sustained people when institutions failed them, of the landladies and doctors and neighbours who chose kindness over cruelty, of the couples who built quiet domestic lives in the margins and refused to let fear prevent love. You and William were part of that story. Two ordinary men who met in a bookshop and built 44 years together. You were not heroes. You were not revolutionaries. You were simply two people who loved each other and found a place that let you survive. That is enough. That has always been enough. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in whatever century you inhabit, spare a thought for the men who walked the Brighton seafront before you, the ones who held hands in the darkness, the ones who built homes together and called each other lodgers, The ones who planted roses and argued about tea and grew old side by side. The ones who left almost no trace except the traces that mattered. The houses they lived in, the graves they share. The proof that love survived even when survival seemed impossible. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. They could not marry, but they built marriages anyway. They could not be remembered, but they insisted on existing. And because they existed, because they survived, because they loved despite everything, the men who came after them knew it was possible. The network extended forward, generation after generation, each one learning from the last, each one pushing the boundaries a little further, each one surviving a little more openly. Brighton today is a city that celebrates its queer history with pride parades and rainbow flags and historical markers. But underneath that celebration is the foundation laid by people whose names we will never know, who loved in secret and died in silence and trusted that someday someone would remember. We remember, not the names perhaps, but the lives, not the individuals, but the pattern, not the details that were carefully erased, but the outline that remains. 2 graves in a Victorian cemetery, side by side, marked only with names and dates. 2 men who chose each other every day for 44 years in a world that told them their love was impossible. 2 ordinary lives that proved the world was wrong. That is the story of queer Brighton. That is the story that needs to be told. Because somewhere tonight, someone is afraid they are the only one. Someone is wondering if love like theirs can survive. Someone needs to know that we have always been here, that we have always found each other, that survival is possible, even when it seems impossible. You and William survived. Thousands like you survived. And because they survived, we are here. We are their legacy, carrying forward the knowledge that love wins not through grand gestures, but through the quiet accumulation of days, through the choice to stay when leaving would be easier, through the commitment to build something together, even when the world insists it cannot be built. So sleep well tonight, knowing you are part of that legacy, knowing that every day you exist openly is a tribute to the ones who could not, knowing that the love you give and receive is connected to all the love that came before, stretching back through history to the bookshops and boarding houses and seaside towns where men found each other and refused to let go. The Victorian era ended in 1901 with your death and the death of Queen Victoria herself. The new century brought new challenges and new possibilities. But the human need for love and connection remained constant, as it always has, as it always will. Brighton kept its secrets and its people. The refuge continued. And somewhere in the archives, in the gaps between documented facts, in the silence where names used to be, you and William exist still. 2 men who loved each other, who survived together, who proved that even in the darkest times, love finds a way. May your dreams tonight be filled with the sound of the sea, with the light on the water, with the warmth of someone's hand in yours. May you rest knowing that you are connected to everyone who has ever loved against the odds, everyone who has ever built a life in the margins, everyone who has ever chosen courage over fear. Good night and sleep well.